In the autumn of 1911, Greene County, Iowa was a place where everyone knew each other, where doors were rarely locked, and where a man's word was worth more than any contract. It was a prosperous farming community with family farms passed down from generation to generation, sustained by hard work and mutual trust. But sometimes it is precisely in this apparent tranquility that the most unimaginable horrors hide. What you're about to hear is one of the most shocking stories we've ever told here on Fear Files. A story that forces us to question how many horrors remain hidden behind respectable facades. How many victims suffer in silence just meters away from neighbors who would never suspect the evil lurking so close. Before we continue, tell me where you are watching from. And if this is your first time here on the channel, don't forget to subscribe. You're about to learn one of the most disturbing stories in American criminal history, and I guarantee you'll never look at a farmhouse the same way again. Among the rural properties that dotted the golden landscape of Greene County stood the Hensley farm. Edward Hensley, a robust 43-year-old man, was known for his exceptional skill as an agricultural implement mechanic. His workshop, attached to the main house, served farmers from throughout the region. Neighbors respected him for his punctuality, honesty in business, and ability to repair any equipment that came to his hands. His wife, Florence, was a beloved presence in the community. At 40 years old, she possessed a gentle voice that echoed every Sunday in the Methodist Church Choir in Scranton, the nearest town located just 8 kilometers from the farm. Florence was known for her kindness to those in need, always bringing food baskets to families in difficulty and organizing charity events for the church. The couple had an only daughter, Clara Ara, born in 1895 and now 16 years old. The young woman had inherited her mother's serene beauty and showed interest in studies, dreaming of becoming a teacher. Clara Ara attended the local school and was popular among her friends, known for her intelligence and the shy smile that won everyone over. The Hensley family's life seemed to follow the quiet and predictable rhythm of the countryside seasons. Edward worked in his workshop during the day, serving farmers who came from neighboring properties for repairs on plows, threshers, and other equipment. Florence took care of the house and garden, and Clara Ara divided her time between studies and household chores. It was a family that, in everyone's eyes, represented the American ideal of the time: hardworking, religious, and united. But in October 1911, this apparent harmony began to disintegrate suddenly and inexplicably. Florence, who had always enjoyed robust health, began to present strange symptoms. First came intense headaches, followed by episodes of nausea and extreme weakness. Within days, the woman who sang vigorously in the choir could barely get out of bed. Dr. Harry Price, the local physician, was called to the Hensley farm. After examining Florence, he diagnosed typhoid fever, a common disease at the time due to contamination of well and system water. The diagnosis seemed plausible, as symptoms of arsenic poisoning were easily confused with various diseases of the era, and other cases of typhoid fever had been recorded in the county that year. 3 days after the diagnosis, Florence Hensley died. The death was recorded as a natural consequence of typhoid fever, and the funeral was held at the Methodist Church with the presence of practically the entire community. Edward seemed devastated by the loss, and Clara Ara, at 16 years old, cried inconsolably beside her mother's coffin. What no one could imagine was that years later, during a police interrogation, Edward Hensley would coldly confess that there had never been any fever at all. He had poisoned his wife with small doses of arsenic, easily obtained as rat poison, and suffocated her with a pillow when she became too weak to resist. His justification would be as shocking as the crime. Florence began asking questions about my behavior with Clara Ara. She threatened to tell the pastor about things she had noticed. After Florence's funeral, life at the Hensley farm took on a completely different dynamic. Edward, who had previously shared domestic responsibilities with his wife, now saw himself as solely responsible for Clara Ara. What initially seemed like the natural care of a widowed father soon revealed itself to be something much more sinister and controlling. The first changes were subtle, but some more observant neighbors began to notice small oddities. Edward began accompanying Clara Ara in all her activities outside the home, something he hadn't done when Florence was alive. When she went to school, he personally drove and picked her up, claiming concern for his daughter's safety after losing her mother. When Clara wanted to visit friends, Edward insisted on knowing all the details: where she would be, with whom, for how long, and what exactly the purpose of the visit would be. Clara, still grieving and vulnerable from her mother's recent death, initially interpreted this behavior as a manifestation of paternal love. Edward was skillful in justifying his actions with apparently reasonable arguments. "You're all I have left, Clara," he would say with a choked voice. "I can't risk losing you too. The world out there is dangerous for a young woman alone." Gradually, the restrictions intensified. Edward forbade Clara from participating in church social activities, claiming she needed time to process her grief. He canceled her plans to continue her studies to become a teacher, arguing that the family needed her at home. When Clara's friends came to visit her, Edward always found an excuse to interrupt or shorten the encounters. The local community, respectful of the family's mourning period, did not immediately question these changes. It was common for bereaved families to isolate themselves temporarily, and Edward had a solid reputation as a hard-working man and dedicated father. Moreover, the culture of the time dictated that paternal decisions about unmarried daughters were unquestionable, especially in conservative rural communities. During the winter of 1911-1912, Edward began working on a mysterious project in the house's basement. He told Clara he was renovating the space to create a larger storage area for tools and winter supplies. The sound of hammers, saws, and heavy work echoed from the lower part of the house for hours, especially at night and on weekends, when Edward claimed to have more free time from the workshop. Mrs. Agnes Thompson, the nearest neighbor, occasionally commented to other women in the community about the strange sounds coming from the Hensley property during unusual hours. "That man works very late," she would say. "Sometimes I hear hammering until after midnight." But these observations were attributed to Edward's grief and his need to keep busy. Clara occasionally offered help, but Edward always refused, saying the work was too heavy and dangerous for a young woman. He kept the basement door locked and carried the key with him at all times. When questioned about the renovation's progress, Edward gave vague answers, quickly changing the subject. During this period, Clara began to notice changes in her father's behavior that made her uncomfortable. Edward constantly watched her, even inside the house, as if studying her every movement. He asked detailed questions about her thoughts, her dreams, her conversations with other people. When Clara showed any sign of independence or questioned his decisions, Edward reacted with explosions of anger, followed by periods of icy silence. Clara's social isolation deepened when Edward completely forbade her visits to town. He took over all shopping and external business, claiming that Clara was too young and inexperienced to deal with merchants. Clara's friends, initially understanding of the family's grief, began to find the young woman's prolonged isolation strange. In December 1911, Sarah Mitchell, Clara's best friend, tried to visit her without warning. Edward received her at the door, explaining that Clara was ill and couldn't receive visitors. When Sarah asked if she could at least speak to Clara through the bedroom window, Edward became hostile, saying his daughter needed absolute rest and that visits would only hinder her recovery. Sarah left the Hensley farm with a strange feeling. She had known Clara since childhood and had never seen her sick for so long. Moreover, there was something in Edward's expression, a coldness in his eyes that she had never noticed before. When Sarah shared her concerns with other friends, they decided to try a different approach. The following Sunday after church service, a group of young people from the community went to the Hensley farm for a courtesy visit. Edward received them in the yard, physically blocking access to the house. He explained that Clara had contracted a contagious form of flu and that the doctor had recommended total isolation. When they asked if they could at least leave a fruit basket for her recovery, Edward accepted, but made it clear that no visits would be allowed until further notice. Weeks passed, and Clara didn't appear at church, school, or anywhere public. Edward continued his normal activities, working in the workshop and interacting with clients, but always avoided conversations about his daughter. When someone asked about Clara, he gave short answers and quickly changed the subject, behavior that some clients began to find strange. During this period, the noises in the basement intensified. Edward's project was becoming increasingly elaborate, involving not only carpentry but also masonry and metalwork. He had begun forging iron pieces in his workshop during the night, claiming they were for property improvements. Edward's basement project lasted almost 2 complete years, from December 1911 to October 1913. During this period, he meticulously constructed a secret compartment behind a false wall in the basement. The space, approximately 3 men outer by 4, was accessible only through a heavy iron door forged by Edward himself in his workshop during the early morning hours. Edward had planned every detail with the precision of an engineer. The compartment had double walls, the outer one of original basement stone and an inner one of new bricks, with a space between them filled with fresh sawdust and rags to partially muffle sounds. He had installed small ventilation holes disguised among the foundation stones, connected to a rudimentary system that extended to the base of the house's chimney. The iron door was his masterpiece of sinister engineering, equipped with multiple locks and a small slot through which food and water could be passed. It was heavy enough to be impossible to move from the inside. Edward had repeatedly tested the ventilation system, ensuring it provided enough air to keep someone alive, though in uncomfortable conditions. The space included a simple wooden bed, a small table, a chair, and a metal bucket for basic needs. A small window at the top at ground level provided limited light during the day, but was positioned so that no one from outside could see the interior. Edward had camouflaged this window with dense bushes planted strategically. Throughout this entire construction period, Clara Ara turned 17 in September 1912 and then 18 in September 1913. Her isolation had become almost total. Edward had spread stories about her prolonged illness that kept neighbors away, but some people began to question the situation. On the morning of March 15, 1913, a dense fog covered the fields of Greene County. It was one of those gray late winter days when the moisture-laden air seemed to herald changes. For Clara Ara Hensley, now 17 and 1 or 2 years old, it would be the last day she would see sunlight as a free person. Edward had carefully planned every aspect of what was about to happen. For weeks he had observed the neighbors' movement patterns, identified the times when the rural road was most deserted, and calculated exactly how much time he would have to execute his plan without interruption. His experience as a mechanic had taught him the importance of precision and detailed planning. That morning, Edward woke Clara earlier than usual, claiming he needed her help moving some heavy equipment in the basement. "I finally finished the renovation," he explained with the calm voice that Clara had learned not to question. "I need to position a heavy door, and you can help me carry it. It won't take long." Clara, still sleepy and wearing only a nightgown and robe, followed her father to the kitchen. Edward had prepared coffee and toast, an apparently caring gesture that was actually part of his strategy to keep his daughter calm and unsuspecting. While Clara Ara drank coffee, Edward discreetly checked if there was any movement on the road through the kitchen window. "Let's go down now," Edward said after a few minutes. "I want to finish this before Mrs. Thompson wakes up and the noise bothers her." Clara Ara nodded, knowing her father's concern for the elderly neighbor. She couldn't imagine that Edward was actually ensuring that no one would hear what was about to happen. The Hensley basement was a spacious area with stone walls and low ceiling, typical of rural constructions of the era. Edward had installed several oil lamps to illuminate the environment during his months of secret work. The smell of fresh wood, cement, and metal still permeated the air, evidence of the extensive renovations he had carried out. Edward led Clara to a specific area of the basement, where a heavy iron door was leaning against the newly built wall. The door was impressive in its solidity, clearly forged to last decades. "I need you to help me position it in this opening," Edward said, pointing to a gap in the wall that Clara Ara hadn't noticed before. While Clara Ara positioned herself to help carry the door, Edward discreetly grabbed a cloth he had left prepared on a nearby shelf. The cloth was soaked with ether, a substance Edward had bought at the Scranton pharmacy a few weeks earlier, claiming he needed it to clean delicate pieces of agricultural equipment. A perfectly plausible explanation for a mechanic. "Clara Ara, can you hold this end?" Edward asked, positioning himself behind his daughter. The moment Clara Ara bent down to grab the door, Edward pressed the ether-soaked cloth against her face. Clara Ara tried to scream, but the sound was muffled by the cloth. She struggled for a few seconds, but the ether quickly took effect, and her body went limp in her father's arms. Edward carried the unconscious Clara Ara through the opening in the wall, entering the secret compartment he had built over almost 2 years. The space was claustrophobic, but functional. He placed Clara Ara on the simple bed and quickly exited, sealing the opening with the heavy iron door. When Clara Ara woke up several hours later, the reality of her situation gradually imposed itself. She was in a small, dark space with stone walls and a single light source coming from the small window above. The door through which she had entered was now a solid iron barrier with no handle on the inside. Clara screamed, banged on the door, and begged to be freed, but her voices echoed only in the confined space, partially muffled by the insulation Edward had installed. Edward, from the outside, heard his daughter's muffled screams with an impassive expression. He had psychologically prepared himself for this moment, convincing himself that he was doing what was necessary to keep Clara Ara safe and under his control. When the screams became more desperate, Edward went up to the main house where he began implementing the second phase of his plan. During the following days, Edward began spreading the story he had carefully prepared. He told neighbors that Clara Ara had run away during the night with a young seed salesman who had passed through the region the previous week. The story was plausible. Young women occasionally ran away with men who promised a better life in big cities, especially after family traumas like the death of a parent. Edward played the role of a devastated father with convincing skill. He sought out the local sheriff, reporting Clara Ara's disappearance and providing a detailed description of the supposed salesman. He cried during the conversation, claiming he felt guilty for not having noticed the signs that Clara Ara was planning to run away. The community reacted with sympathy and understanding. Edward had already lost his wife and now seemed to have lost his daughter, too. Neighbors offered support and helped to search for Clara Ara, but Edward politely declined, saying he preferred to handle the situation privately and hoped Clara Ara would return when she matured. To reinforce his story, Edward began showing letters supposedly written by Clara Ara. These letters were posted from neighboring cities during his occasional trips to fetch equipment parts or serve clients on more distant farms. In the letters, Clara Ara said she was well, but didn't reveal her exact location, claiming fear that her father would force her to return home. The letters were written on common paper bought at Scranton's general store and with ink from the same source. Edward had practiced Clara Ara's handwriting for weeks, copying old letters she had written to friends. The content of the letters was carefully crafted to discourage searches. Clara Ara claimed to be happy, but asked that the family respect her decision to start a new life away from home. Meanwhile, in the secret compartment of the basement, Clara Ara faced the terrifying reality of her situation. Edward came down daily to bring simple food, cornbread, cooked beans, water, and occasionally some vegetables from his garden. He spoke little during these visits, limiting himself to basic instructions about behavior and hygiene. Clara Ara tried several times to convince her father to free her, promising she wouldn't tell anyone about what had happened. She begged, cried, and tried to appeal to any vestige of paternal love that might exist in Edward. But he remained cold and determined, explaining that Clara Ara was safer where she was, and that in time she would understand he was doing this out of love. Weeks turned into months, and Clara Ara gradually understood that her situation was not temporary. Edward had planned to keep her prisoner indefinitely. The young woman who dreamed of becoming a teacher now faced the prospect of spending the rest of her life in a 3A4M space, completely dependent on the will of a man who had revealed himself to be a monster. Sarah Mitchell, worried about her best friend's disappearance, tried several times over the following months to obtain more information from Edward. She visited the farm occasionally, always receiving the same story about Clara Ara having run away. Although Sarah suspected something was wrong, the culture of the time and Edward's paternal authority made it difficult to openly question his version of events. The Greene County community continued its normal life, occasionally commenting on Clara Hensley's disappearance, but gradually accepting the version of events presented by Edward. No one suspected that just meters from their homes and churches, a young woman was being held prisoner by her own father, beginning an ordeal that would last exactly 11 years. If you're enjoying this disturbing story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. What comes next is even more shocking, and you won't want to miss any detail of this investigation. Clara's first months of captivity were marked by desperate resistance that gradually transformed into forced resignation. The secret compartment in the Hensley farm basement became a miniature world governed by Edward's arbitrary rules and the relentless routine of survival. Edward had established a rigid control system that demonstrated both his meticulous nature and his complete lack of empathy. He descended to the basement every day at the same time, usually in the late afternoon when he was certain there would be no unexpected visitors. He carried with him a simple tray with basic food, cornbread, cooked beans, water, and occasionally some vegetables from his garden. During these daily visits, Edward maintained one-sided conversations with Clara, talking about community events, weather changes, and matters related to his workshop. He acted as if the situation were completely normal, as if Clara were a voluntary guest rather than a prisoner. When Clara tried to argue, plead, or question her situation, Edward simply ignored her words or responded with calculated coldness. "You're safe here," was his standard response to any protest. "Out there are dangers you don't understand, men who could hurt you, influences that could corrupt you. Here, I can protect you from all of that." Edward had constructed a delusional narrative in his mind where Clara's captivity was an act of extreme paternal love, not a heinous crime. To keep Clara under control, Edward implemented a punishment system that revealed his calculated cruelty. When Clara screamed too loudly or refused to eat, he temporarily blocked the ventilation holes with rags, letting the air become stale and suffocating for hours. When she tried to damage the door or walls, he removed the oil lamp, leaving her in complete darkness for days. The cruelest punishment was absolute silence. Edward sometimes went weeks without visiting Clara, leaving food and water through the door slot without saying a word. During these periods, Clara was completely isolated from human contact, hearing only the muffled sounds of normal life happening above her head, footsteps on the floor, occasional voices of visitors, the noise from Edward's workshop. As months turned into years, Clara developed psychological survival strategies. She created elaborate routines to mark the passage of time, making small scratches on the stone wall to count the days. She invented complex stories in her mind, recreating happy memories from her childhood and imagining scenarios where she was rescued and reunited with friends. Clara also began sewing rag dolls using scraps from her clothes and threads pulled from blankets. These dolls became her only companions, and she created elaborate personalities for each one, maintaining imaginary conversations that helped her preserve her sanity. Edward occasionally noticed these dolls during his visits, but never commented on them, perhaps recognizing they were necessary for Clara's mental stability. During the 4th year of captivity in 1917, Clara became pregnant. The pregnancy resulted from Edward's systematic abuse, which had become progressively more invasive and controlling. Clara tried to hide the pregnancy as much as possible, fearing Edward's reactions. But eventually it became impossible to disguise her condition. Edward reacted to the pregnancy with a mixture of disturbed satisfaction and practical concern. He began bringing more nutritious food to Clara, including fresh milk and meat, claiming he wanted to ensure the baby's health. At the same time, he intensified his security measures, constantly checking for signs that anyone might suspect unusual activities on the property. Clara's first child was born in 1918 but was stillborn. Edward hastily buried the baby in a remote area of the property, marking the spot only with a small stone. Clara was devastated by the loss, but Edward showed little emotion, treating the event as a minor inconvenience to his plans. In 1919, Clara became pregnant again. This time, the baby was born healthy, a boy Edward decided to name Thomas. To explain the child's presence, Edward spread the story that he had found the baby abandoned on the roadside during one of his trips to fetch equipment parts. The community, knowing Edward's reputation as a charitable man, accepted the story without question. Edward took Thomas to live in the main house, raising him as his orphaned nephew. The child grew up not knowing his mother was imprisoned just meters away. Clara could occasionally hear Thomas's voice playing in the yard above, a sound that filled her simultaneously with joy and despair. In 1921, Clara gave birth to another child, also a boy whom Edward named James. As he had done with Thomas, Edward presented James to the community as another orphan he had rescued. The story became part of Edward's reputation as a generous man who cared for children in need. Clara's fourth child was born in 1922, a girl Edward decided to keep in the secret compartment with her mother. He named the child Ruth and offered no detailed explanations to the community about her presence, only occasionally mentioning he was caring for another child in need. Ruth's presence in the compartment brought a new dimension to Clara's suffering. On one hand, she finally had constant companionship and a renewed purpose to survive. On the other hand, she watched her daughter growing up in deplorable conditions without access to education, adequate medical care, or normal social interaction. Ruth grew up knowing only the claustrophobic world of the secret compartment. For her, life consisted of stone walls, limited light from the small window, and daily visits from the man she learned to call Grandpa Edward. Clara did her best to educate her daughter, teaching her to read using an old Bible that Edward had provided, and telling stories about the outside world. During these years, Edward continued to maintain his facade in the community. He raised Thomas and James as adopted children, and both boys grew up believing Edward was their benefactor. The community respected Edward for his apparent generosity in caring for orphaned children without suspecting the horrible circumstances of their birth. Clara's fake letters continued to arrive sporadically, posted from different cities as Edward traveled for business. In the letters, Clara vaguely mentioned being well and occasionally sent gifts to her father, actually items Edward bought for himself. The community gradually stopped asking about Clara, accepting that she had chosen a new life away from home. Some neighbors, however, began to notice small inconsistencies in Edward's behavior over the years. Mrs. Thompson occasionally commented that Edward seemed more nervous when someone mentioned Clara. Mr. William Foster, who frequently brought equipment for repair, noticed that Edward sometimes seemed distracted and anxious, especially when there were children playing near the property. In 1924, after exactly 11 years of captivity, Clara had become a 28-year-old woman prematurely aged by trauma and deplorable living conditions. Her daughter Ruth, now 2 years old, was beginning to show worrying signs of health problems related to lack of sunlight and adequate fresh air. Clara knew that if something didn't change soon, both she and Ruth might not survive much longer. What Clara didn't know was that fate was about to intervene in a way that neither she nor Edward could have predicted. Little Ruth, growing up in the unhealthy environment of the secret compartment, was developing a condition that would force Edward to make a decision, that would finally expose his crimes to the light of day. The carefully constructed system of lies and control that Edward had maintained for more than a decade was about to crumble. Not due to police investigation or community suspicions, but because of the vulnerability of an innocent child who had been born in the depths of a nightmare. In the harsh winter of 1924, Greene County was hit by a wave of respiratory diseases that especially affected children. Whooping cough, a highly contagious bacterial infection, spread rapidly through rural communities where access to medical care was limited and living conditions were often precarious. Ruth Hensley, now 2 years old, had spent her entire life in the humid and poorly ventilated environment of the secret compartment. Her health had always been fragile due to lack of sunlight, fresh air, and adequate nutrition. When the whooping cough epidemic reached the county, Ruth was one of the first victims, rapidly developing a violent and persistent cough that left her breathless for long periods. Clara Ara watched with growing despair as her daughter struggled to breathe. Ruth's coughing fits were so intense that the child frequently vomited and her lips turned blue from lack of oxygen. Clara Ara begged Edward during his daily visits, pleading for him to take Ruth to a doctor. But Edward initially resisted, fearing that exposing the child would raise inconvenient questions. "She'll get better," Edward insisted, bringing ineffective home remedies like herbal teas and syrups bought at the local pharmacy. But as days passed, it became clear that Ruth was rapidly worsening. The child had lost weight dramatically. Her skin was pale as paper, and her cough had become so severe that Clara feared she might die at any moment. Edward faced a terrible dilemma. On one hand, taking Ruth to the hospital would mean exposing the child to medical scrutiny and possibly raising questions about her living conditions. On the other hand, if Ruth died, he would lose not only the child, but also an important tool of control over Clara Ara. Moreover, explaining the death of a child supposedly under his care would be extremely difficult. On the morning of February 12, 1924, Ruth had a particularly severe crisis that left her unconscious for several minutes. Clara Ara screamed and banged on the compartment door with such desperation that Edward, working in his workshop above, could clearly hear her pleas through the partial insulation. When he came down to check the situation, he found Ruth with blue lips and extremely labored breathing. Realizing the child could die within hours, Edward made a decision that would change everything. He carried Ruth out of the compartment and took her to Greene County Hospital, located in the town of Scranton, just 8 kilometers from the farm. It was a cold and foggy morning, and Edward hoped few staff members would be on duty. Edward arrived at the hospital carrying Ruth wrapped in blankets, telling head nurse Helen Armstrong that the child was his goddaughter and had suddenly fallen ill during the night. Helen, an experienced 45-year-old woman who had worked at the hospital for more than 2 decades, immediately noticed the child's critical condition and took her for urgent medical examination. Dr. Robert Clark, the attending physician, quickly identified the classic symptoms of severe whooping cough, complicated by evident malnutrition and possible pneumonia. While initiating emergency treatment, Dr. Clark asked several questions about Ruth's medical history, diet, and living conditions. Edward's vague and inconsistent answers began to raise suspicions. Helen Armstrong, observing the interaction between Edward and the child, noticed several disturbing details. Ruth seemed afraid of Edward, shrinking when he approached. The child was extremely pale, as if she had never been exposed to sunlight, and her reaction to the hospital's bright lights suggested she wasn't accustomed to well-lit environments. Even more concerning was Ruth's limited and antiquated vocabulary. Although she was 2 years old, the child already spoke some words, but used expressions and grammatical constructions that seemed from an earlier era, as if she had learned to speak from someone who had grown up decades before. Additionally, Ruth showed clear signs of delayed development, both physical and mental. Helen Armstrong had worked at the hospital during the period of Clara Ara Hensley's disappearance 11 years earlier. She vaguely remembered the case and the commotion it had caused in the community. Observing Ruth more closely, Helen began to notice striking physical similarities between the child and her memories of Clara Ara. The same distinctive green eyes, the same delicate facial structure, the same light brown hair with natural waves. During Ruth's second day of hospitalization, Helen decided to investigate her suspicions. When questioned at the time, Edward had explained it was just one of the children he cared for, but Mrs. Thompson found it strange that the child was never seen playing in the yard like Thomas and James. Armed with this circumstantial but substantial evidence, Briggs obtained a search warrant for the Hensley property. On the morning of February 18, 1924, he arrived at the farm accompanied by 2 deputies and Samuel Morrison, an experienced carpenter from town who could identify recent structural modifications. Edward tried to remain calm when the officers arrived, but his nervousness was evident. He allowed them to search the main house and workshop, but when Briggs mentioned the basement, Edward hesitated visibly before agreeing to show the way. In the basement, Morrison immediately noticed inconsistencies in the masonry. One section of the wall appeared significantly newer than the rest of the structure, and there were signs that an opening had been recently sealed. The mortar was a slightly different color, and some bricks appeared to have been removed and replaced. When questioned about these modifications, Edward claimed to have made structural repairs years earlier to prevent water infiltration. Briggs ordered the suspicious wall to be examined more thoroughly. Using tools brought from Edward's workshop, the deputies began carefully removing stones from the newest section. After several hours of meticulous work, they discovered a heavy iron door hidden behind the false wall. The door was equipped with multiple locks and a small slot for passing food. Edward, realizing his discovery was inevitable, finally admitted to having the key, but claimed the compartment was used only for storing valuable items and important documents. When Briggs opened the door and entered the secret compartment, he found Clara Ara Hensley, now 28 years old, sitting on a simple bed in a claustrophobic space that had been her prison for exactly 11 years. The walls were marked with hundreds of small scratches, some already faded by time, marking the endless days of her captivity. Rag dolls made from clothing scraps were scattered around the space, some in a state of deterioration, evidence of Clara Ara's desperate efforts to maintain her sanity over the years. Clara Ara, initially terrified by the presence of strangers, gradually understood she was being rescued. She was physically debilitated, extremely pale, and visibly traumatized, but mentally lucid enough to provide a detailed account of her experience. Her first words were, "Ruth, where is my daughter, Ruth?" The discovery shocked not only the officers present, but the entire Greene County community. Edward Hensley, the respected farmer and mechanic who had raised 2 orphans and maintained an impeccable reputation for more than a decade, had actually kept his own daughter as a prisoner, systematically abused her, and created an elaborate network of lies to hide his crimes. The case would become one of the most shocking in Iowa's criminal history, not only because of the nature of the crimes, but because of the duration of the deception and the complete failure of the community to detect signs of the horror happening right under their noses. The discovery of Clara Hensley in the secret compartment of her father's farm sent shockwaves through Greene County and beyond. Within hours, news spread to newspapers throughout Iowa, and reporters from Des Moines and Cedar Rapids began arriving at the small rural community that had never experienced such media attention. Clara was immediately taken to Greene County Hospital, where she was reunited with her daughter Ruth for the first time in an adequate medical environment. The reunion was emotionally devastating for both. Ruth, who had spent her entire life knowing only the claustrophobic environment of the compartment, was initially terrified by the open space and bright hospital lights, but gradually calmed in her mother's arms. Dr. Robert Clark conducted complete medical examinations on both victims. Clara Ara showed severe signs of nutritional deficiency, chronic anemia, and extensive psychological damage. Her skin was extremely pale due to lack of sun exposure, and she had developed vision problems related to years of inadequate light. More concerning were the physical signs of prolonged abuse and multiple pregnancies under deplorable conditions. Ruth, besides the whooping cough that had precipitated her discovery, showed serious signs of delayed development due to the conditions of her birth and upbringing. Her bone structure was fragile. Her immune system was severely compromised, and she demonstrated behaviors indicating deep psychological trauma, including extreme fear of open spaces and strangers. Meanwhile, Edward Hensley was arrested and taken to the county jail in Scranton. During the initial interrogation, he maintained a defiant attitude, insisting he had protected Clara Ara from dangerous outside influences. When confronted with physical evidence of his crimes, Edward finally confessed not only to Clara Ara's captivity, but also to the murder of his wife Florence in 1911. Florence began asking questions about my behavior with Clara Ara, Edward admitted during the interrogation transcribed by the clerk. She threatened to tell the pastor and doctor about things she had noticed. I couldn't allow her to destroy our family with her unfounded suspicions. Edward coldly described how he had poisoned Florence with arsenic over several weeks before suffocating her when she became too weak to resist. Edward's confession also revealed the fate of Clara Ara's other children. Thomas and James, the boys Edward had raised as rescued orphans, were actually Clara Ara's children born during her captivity. Edward had separated the boys from their mother when they were babies, raising them in the main house while keeping Clara Ara imprisoned in the basement. Thomas, now 5 years old, and James, 3 years old, were carefully informed of the truth about their parentage by church members and volunteer families from the community who offered to help. The revelation was traumatic for both children, especially for Thomas, who was old enough to partially understand the situation. They had grown up believing Edward was their generous benefactor, not knowing their biological mother was imprisoned just meters away. Clara Ara, despite her deep trauma, insisted on providing complete testimony about her experience. She categorically refused any contact with Edward, but provided a detailed written account that became crucial evidence in the criminal proceedings. Her testimony described not only the physical aspects of her captivity, but also the systematic psychological manipulation Edward had employed to keep her under control. "He constantly told me that the outside world had become too dangerous for me," Clara Ara wrote in her testimony, "that people had forgotten me and that no one would look for me. He created a world where I depended completely on him to survive, where questioning his decisions resulted in punishments that made me fear for my life. In the early years, I still had hope of escaping. Later, I only hoped to survive." Edward Hensley's trial began in September 1924 and attracted significant regional attention. Journalists from Des Moines, Cedar Rapids, and Davenport traveled to Scranton to cover the case. The courtroom was packed every day with people lining up from dawn to get seats. Prosecutor James Morrison presented a devastating case against Edward. Besides Clara Ara's testimony and physical evidence from the secret compartment, Morrison brought medical experts who testified about the effects of prolonged captivity on the victim's physical and mental health. He also presented evidence confirming that Florence Hensley had been poisoned with arsenic based on the exhumation of her body. Edward's defense, led by local attorney Robert Hayes, tried to argue temporary insanity, claiming that Florence's death had caused a mental breakdown that led Edward to make irrational decisions. Hayes argued that Edward genuinely believed he was protecting Clara Ara, though in an extremely misguided way. However, evidence of premeditation was overwhelming. The secret compartment had been built over almost 2 years with meticulous planning. Clara's fake letters demonstrated a deliberate disinformation campaign that lasted more than a decade. Florence's murder had been carefully planned and executed over weeks. During the trial, several community members testified about Edward's behavior over the years. While many expressed shock at the revelations, some admitted noticing small, strange signs they had ignored at the time. Clara Ara's growing isolation before her disappearance, Edward's reluctance to discuss his daughter, and occasional construction sounds coming from the property during unusual hours. Sarah Mitchell, Clara Ara's former best friend, gave particularly moving testimony. She described her attempts to visit Clara Ara in the month before the disappearance and how Edward had systematically blocked all contact. "I knew something was wrong," Sarah testified with tears in her eyes. "But I never could have imagined something so horrible. I feel guilty for not insisting more, for not questioning more deeply." Mrs. Agnes Thompson also testified about the strange sounds she heard coming from the Hensley property for years. "Especially during the night, I always thought Edward worked very hard," she said. "But now I realized there was something more sinister happening. If I had been more curious, maybe Clara Ara could have been saved years earlier." The trial also revealed the extent of Edward's manipulation in the community. He had carefully cultivated his reputation as a charitable man and dedicated father, using this facade to deflect suspicion. His skill as a mechanic and willingness to help neighbors with repairs had created a network of goodwill that made it almost impossible for anyone to question his actions. In October 1924, after only 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Edward Hensley guilty of first-degree murder for Florence's death, aggravated kidnapping, false imprisonment, and multiple charges of sexual abuse. Judge Samuel Crawford, a 30-year veteran of Iowa's judicial system, described Edward's crimes as among the most depraved and calculated I have witnessed in my career. Edward was sentenced to life imprisonment at Fort Madison State Penitentiary. During the reading of the sentence, He remained impassive, showing the same emotional coldness he had demonstrated throughout the trial. His only words were, "I did what I thought necessary to protect my family." After the trial, Clara Ara faced the monumental challenge of rebuilding her life and reuniting with her children. Thomas and James were temporarily placed in the care of volunteer church families, while Clara Ara received intensive medical treatment and emotional support. The family reunion was a gradual and carefully supervised process, recognizing the trauma all the children had suffered. Clara Ara, now 29 years old, had lost more than a decade of her life. The world had changed significantly during her captivity. World War I had ended. New technologies like radio were becoming common, and American society was undergoing profound cultural transformations. Clara Ara had to relearn basic social skills and adapt to a world that had evolved without her. The Greene County community reacted to the case with a mixture of horror, guilt, and determination to support the victims. A fundraising campaign was organized by the Methodist Church to help Clara Ara and her children start new lives. Local families offered temporary shelter, clothing, and emotional support. However, media attention also brought challenges. Reporters constantly tried to interview Clara Ara and photograph the children, forcing the family to move several times to escape public scrutiny. Clara Ara, who had spent more than a decade isolated from the world, found the constant attention almost as traumatic as her captivity. In 1925, Clara Ara and her children moved to Des Moines, where she could receive specialized medical treatment, and the children could attend schools better equipped to handle their special needs. Clara never remarried, dedicating her life entirely to raising her children and her own recovery. Ruth, the daughter born in captivity, faced the greatest adaptation challenges. She had spent her first years of life in a claustrophobic space, and the transition to the outside world was extremely difficult. Ruth developed severe agoraphobia and took years to feel comfortable in open spaces or with groups of people. She never fully recovered from the effects of her birth and upbringing in captivity. Thomas and James, though traumatized by the revelation about their true parentage, adapted more quickly to normal life. Both eventually graduated from high school and built respectable careers, though they carried emotional scars from their unique experience. Thomas became a carpenter, and James worked as a bank clerk, both leading quiet lives and avoiding any publicity about their past. The Hensley farm was abandoned after the trial. No buyer was interested in the property, and it gradually fell into ruins. The secret compartment in the basement was permanently sealed by authorities, but the house became a dark symbol in the local community. For decades, the property was known by residents as the basement house. Local children created urban legends about the place, and occasionally morbid curiosity seekers tried to visit the abandoned property. The house was finally demolished in 1967, but the land remained empty, as if the community wanted to physically erase the memory of the horrors that had happened there. Edward Hensley died in prison in 1951 at age 83 after serving 27 years of his life sentence. He never expressed remorse for his crimes and rarely received visitors. His final years were marked by age-related health problems and almost complete isolation from other prisoners who avoided him due to the nature of his crimes. Clara Ara lived until 1978. Dying at age 83 in Des Moines, she had become a quiet advocate for domestic crime victims' rights, working with local organizations to help other women who had suffered abuse. Despite her trauma, Clara Ara managed to find purpose in helping others and raising her children to be functional and compassionate adults. The Hensley case had lasting impacts on Iowa's criminal justice system. It led to the implementation of more rigorous protocols for missing person investigations and the creation of specialized programs for prolonged captivity victims. The case also influenced changes in state legislation related to domestic crimes and child abuse. The Hensley family story remains one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history, not only because of the nature of the crimes, but because of what it reveals about our capacity to ignore danger signs when they contradict our social expectations. Edward Hensley managed to maintain his facade of respectability for more than a decade, creating one of the most successful disinformation campaigns ever documented. He exploited people's natural tendency to trust respected community members and the cultural reluctance to question paternal authority. The case also highlights the vulnerability of young women in early 20th century rural society where geographic isolation and conservative social norms created ideal conditions for predators to operate undetected. Clara Hensley lost the most formative years of her life, but her survival and eventual recovery demonstrate the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the story is how an entire community was deceived for so long. The Hensleys' neighbors lived their normal lives just meters from one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, never suspecting the truth. This forces us to question how many other horrors remain hidden behind respectable facades. The Hensley farm may have been demolished, but the lessons of its dark legacy remain relevant today. In an era of instant communication and technological surveillance, is it still possible for similar crimes to go unnoticed? The answer, unfortunately, is yes. Modern cases of domestic captivity continue to shock the world, proving that human capacity for evil and deception has not diminished with time. Clara Hensley's story is ultimately a story of survival against impossible odds. It's a reminder that even in the most desperate circumstances, hope can persist. And it's a warning that we must remain vigilant. For the most dangerous monsters are often those who hide in plain sight, protected by our own reluctance to believe such horrors are possible. The echo of Clara's screams in the secret basement compartment may have long since fallen silent, but her story continues to resonate as a testament to the need to question, investigate, and never accept that appearances always reflect reality. For sometimes, the greatest horrors hide in the most unexpected places, waiting only for the right moment to be revealed. If you were shocked by this story, subscribe now. We have even more disturbing cases waiting for you. Hit the bell and comment which was the most terrifying moment.